we've already talked in this class about parliamentarism and presidentialism, as well as semi-presidentialism. All these are ways of categorizing democracies based on the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Well, there's another major way of classifying democracies, and that's not according to how the different branches of government relate to one another, but the electoral system, the type of electoral system used to fill the legislature, and in particular what that electoral system is designed to do. This is the majoritarian versus consensus divide. This way of looking at democracy was popularized by Dutch political scientist Aaron Leiphardt in his book Varieties of Democracy. Now it turns out that the type of electoral system is in fact highly correlated with other features of a democracy's political system, like the degree of federalism, the degree of central bank independence, the degree to which the Constitution is easy to change or not, the type of party system, and even the amount of welfare spending. So, in majoritarian democracy, the electoral system manufactures parliamentary majorities. Usually it does this by using single-member districts, which encourages the formation of two large parties. And I'll talk about how electoral systems encourage the formation of parties a little bit later when we talk about electoral systems. But basically the idea of majoritarian democracy is to make sure that majorities can govern relatively unimpeded. Other common features that correlate with this ambition include a single-party executive, a dominant executive, a single legislature, or if there's two chambers of the legislature, then very weak bicameralism, which means just two chambers of legislature. Constitutions that are fairly easily amended by majorities, fairly weak to no federalism, and weak to no central bank independence. Now, consensus democracy, on the other hand, doesn't try to manufacture parliamentary majorities. It tries to, as best it can, represent the population in its legislature. And usually it does this with some form of proportional representation. Right? So, roughly speaking, what this means is that whatever percentage of the vote a party gets, that's the percentage of representation they get in the legislature. Here, political institutions try to, by representing the people, try to achieve consensus between a wider range of political actors. That's why it's called consensus democracy. Other features here include multi-party executives, so that's where the cabinet has ministers from different parties, a more balanced relationship between the executive and the legislature, bicameral legislatures, more rigid constitutions that are hard to change, federalism, and more independent central banks. Now, in theory, under majoritarianism, you have more vertical accountability. Now, vertical accountability simply means that voters can clearly see who is responsible and accountable for political outcomes, right? If you manufacture a majority and you put that majority in power and you put fairly few obstacles in its way in exercising power, then most of the blame or the praise has to go to that majority. And so, in that sense, voters can very easily tell who's responsible, right, for success and for failure. So that's what majoritarianism tends to do. On the other hand, consensus democracy emphasizes what you might call horizontal accountability. And horizontal accountability is when a series of political institutions check and balance one another, keep each other accountable. It's often fairly easy under this view or under this theory of governance, to pass blame around for for problem outcomes, and it makes it hard to figure out who's responsible for what, because after all, in a system of checks and balances, one branch or one cabinet ministry can try to point the blame at another one. Again, when multiple people are responsible for the outcome, it's hard to tell who's most responsible. Now, that's majoritarianism and consensus democracy in theory. In theory, you get more vertical accountability under majoritarianism. Under consensus democracy, each of the parties or each of the actors hold each other accountable, but the voters have a hard time telling who's accountable. In the case of vertical accountability and majoritarianism, of course, it's only voters that keep the legislature and the executive accountable. There is no checks and balances, or very few checks and balances in the system, so no horizontal accountability. Now, in practice, that's the theory. In practice, majoritarian systems can verge on autocratic if one party comes to dominate for too long, or if what we call patronage or clientelism enables party leaders to buy support. Now, patronage and clientelism simply means the exchange of favors for political support, the exchange of economic favors for political support. So the politician provides the favors, for instance, it grants a monopoly or it grants a contract or something, and whoever gets the contract or gets the monopoly then undertakes to provide political support for the political figure in question. So you might look at a country like Japan, where one party dominated the legislature for 30 years, did very well initially and for a long time, but through patronage and clientelism ultimately ended up being thrown out on accusations of corruption. So that's the downside of majoritarianism. You don't put a lot of checks and balances in there. You might end up with a system that's kind of autocratic, particularly if one party manages to manipulate things in its own favor. On the other hand, under consensus systems, you get a lot of gridlock, right? A lot of checks and balances means that there's a lot of different people who have vetoes, right? A lot of veto points. What that means at the end of the day is that you can have a hard time governing, right? A hard time getting things done. So you can see this sort of stereotypically in Italy, more recently in Belgium, where it took a long time. Forming governments is hard, prime ministers don't last 6 months, and constantly the legislature is throwing out prime ministers. This makes it difficult to get anything done, and that can be a problem when you have burning problems in your country. All right. So again, the distinction between parliamentarism and presidentialism has to do with how the executive and the legislature relate. The distinction between majoritarian and consensus democracy has more to do with what the electoral rules are, and then how those electoral rules tend to influence other parts of the government.